Hello, and welcome to Workplace Stories, the podcast where human capital experts share their real-world experiences and insights. Hosted by Red Thread Research, Workplace Stories surfaces the latest industry trends, innovative talent strategies, and best practices for success. Tune in for practical advice on how to best transform your workplace.
Welcome to Workplace Stories. We just finished our conversation with Cole Napper, who is the Global Head of People Analytics at FedEx. Danny, we could have gone on forever.
We really could have.
But at the end, we had to make a hard stop. Actually, really, when it was really getting good. So we might have to have Cole back. But in reflecting on the entire conversation, what did you find interesting?
I loved most of all his just realistic view of what's going on. So a lot of people right now are selling the dream and talking about the dream and talking about the utopia that can be. But when you look at the technology, a lot of it doesn't work. And as much as we love the idea of AI and the things that it can do, it's not quite there yet. So I loved his very sort of pragmatic approach to it from a people analytics standpoint. He talked about a model of change agents and inquisitors. So he said for people analytics person, you basically need three things. You need somebody that can ask the right questions, which is the inquisitor. There's the part in the middle that's the using the data to answer questions. And then the third part is the change agent. And so taking that middle part is where people analytics has largely focused, but we need those other two things in order to be truly useful, which I thought was a really interesting point. The other thing that I love that he talked about is we've been talking a ton about ethical AI and all those types of things. He's pretty specific about using AI for non-value judgment stuff. So basically leaving the decision making to the people, but using AI to get the right information so that those decisions are easier. So I really love that idea of non-value judgment. What about you?
I think to be clear, Cole is not anti-AI at all, right?
Not at all.
No. So I think he's, like you said, he's very realistic, but he also quoted Bill Gates, who had the quote that the advancements that we make in 2 years will probably be underwhelmed by and not able to fully appreciate the changes over 10 years, something to that effect. So I thought that it's important to remember that everything we're saying, he's still a big proponent of AI. The two things that really jumped out at me, one was he said that he has a strong stance in avoiding anti-productive work.
Yeah.
And so when we asked him to describe what does that mean, he said, for instance, if you do some analysis and you have the technology do it, but then you have to go replicate the analysis to prove that the technology was correct, that's anti-productive work. That's not a good way to be using AI. And so having that frame of making sure that you're not redoing work, but using it in productive ways was good. The other thing I liked was we talked about agents and how agents are going to or could change things dramatically, having individual agents who are experts in specific areas and then them working together and how that might completely change the face of HR technology software as we know it.
Yeah, technology software in general, but especially HR. That's when it started getting good. We started talking about context and all kinds of things, and then we had to end. So I hope we get to have him on again. It was a fantastic discussion.
Absolutely was. So we hope you all enjoy it. If you do, please go ahead and like or comment in all the places you can do that. And we also ask you to subscribe. And if you love this stuff, come and join our membership at redthreadresearch.com. We'd love to have you on there. We talk about all this stuff and more within that platform.
If you like what you heard today, check out our Red Thread Research membership. We have a wonderful community. We have studies and research that we publish on a range of people practices as well as HR technology. And we also have discussions on a regular basis, including virtual meetups and all sorts of other things to get you connected to the insights you need to solve your biggest people problems. Check us out at members.redthreadresearch.com.
Welcome to Workplace Stories, Cole. We are so glad you're finally here.
Finally.
Finally here. So for those of you listening, I had the opportunity to be on Cole's podcast about a year ago, a little under a year ago. And he said, when are you going to have me on Workplace Stories? And I said, when are you going to be a practitioner again? And here he is coming to tell his practitioner stories. So We are
I
thrilled to
went
have
back
you
to
here.
be a practitioner just to get this invite.
I was thinking that was probably true.
Yeah.
All right. So for those of you who don't know Cole, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Background in IO psychology. I think that goes a long way in terms of understanding why I focus on things like people analytics. I actually started my field or my career in more of the workforce planning side of things. And that was before the term people analytics even existed. And so the progression I said that I made is I started in workforce planning, which became workforce analytics, which became HR analytics, which became people analytics. But I've never really changed what I do. So I've been doing basically the same thing the whole time. Worked at some big multinational companies in the past. During the pandemic, moved into the startup space, worked for a few different startups. Most recently, one that got acquired by Culture Amp, and then moved back into the practitioner space, like Stacia mentioned. And so now I'm the global head of people analytics at FedEx, who is undergoing incredible amount of transformation at the moment.
So, Cole, you've jumped back into the practitioner space, and today we're going to talk about people analytics and AI. I'm curious as to why we should listen to you.
Well, first of all, you maybe not. I don't know if you should listen to me, but I'd like to think that what I say carries some weight in the field. I've done a lot of work in this space. I would say my last organization was the first company to market in this space with a people analytics AI tool. And when I say AI, I mean the generative AI version, not just predicting things using machine learning, which has been around for quite some time. I've done a lot of the machine learning work myself. I've led teams that have done the machine learning work themselves. I've built products in the space that have done this type of work. And then in the generative AI space, mostly out of necessity for my own podcast, but also in my own work, I stay very much on the bleeding edge of what's going on, kind of just out of personal curiosity, first and foremost. But second of all, I want to be able to speak to it intelligently in front of folks like you guys.
All right. Well, seems as reasonable a reason to listen to you as anything.
Sure.
I'm also going to give just a real quick plug for Cole's podcast, which is Directionally Correct. He has some wonderful guests on that in our space. He co-hosts it with Scott Hines, who's at AWS. And just you all are fun. It's fun and funny to be on. And so if you have a chance, check it out, Directionally Correct. Okay, moving on. In our recent study on people analytics tech, which we dropped last week, we said that AI was overpromised and not yet delivering. Agree? Disagree? What do you think?
So there's like what's broadly going on with AI, and then there's the narrow component, which is just what's happening with AI and people analytics. In the broad component, I think there's a bubble and the bubble's going to pop at some point. And I think by implication, that means in the narrow component of what's going on in people analytics, I think absolutely agree. I think it's really fun to talk about what could be. I think we talk a lot more about what could be rather than what is and what currently exists. And the reality is that what is largely from, a vendor side isn't necessarily revenue generating yet. And from an internal side isn't necessarily value creating yet for your organizations. A lot of it is experimental. A lot of it is quote unquote interesting. And a lot of it, frankly, just doesn't work, which often doesn't get talked about is people, they really lean on the examples of when something does work, but they kind of sweep under the rug the times when they tried a bunch of stuff and they could never get it to work out properly. And that's fine. That goes for any type of new launch. And so I'm not going to necessarily hold that against someone, but I would say largely it has overpromised. But I'll take kind of the other side of it just for a second. I think there's a famous like Bill Gates quote or somebody like that said, people overestimate what you can accomplish in a year and underestimate what you can accomplish in 10 years. And I think within the 5 to 10 year frame, we're going to be quite impressed with AI, but maybe not so much 2 years into this transformation.
Yeah, I do think it is Bill Gates who said that. And I think that's definitely true. I've been reflecting on it. I think some of the limitation of the impact is due to maybe a limitation of our own imagination and what is necessary to get to what that 5 years from now will look like, right? A lot of what's being done now is trying to focus on efficiency. And I think also problems don't necessarily, this is going to sound bad, but need to be solved. Like in the people analytics tech study, the last paragraph, which was directed at vendors and what we're hoping vendors will do with all that information was make sure you're focusing on the business problems that your customers have, not just problems that have bubbled up since November 2022, meaning things you could do with apply a ChatGPT or a big LLM model, but instead things that actually matter to the customer.
I had this viewpoint that I've just recalibrated as of yesterday, but it's fairly similar in why I think there's somewhat of a bubble going on in this space is I saw a social media post from an engineer at OpenAI, and basically they were saying like, well, yeah, we know a lot of the stuff that we've shipped isn't very good. And the reason why is because that's not what we're trying to ship. We're trying to pursue AGI. And so a lot of this stuff is just what we do in our spare time to justify getting a investment in high valuations. But the reality is that's really what we're pursuing. And that's why some of what's out there is not very good. My riff on it pre-yesterday was there's a reason why the only tools that seem to work out of the box in AI have to do with what coders do. And it's because the coders are building it for themselves. And that happens to be the thing that works right now most effectively. The things that work least effectively are the things that normal human beings who are not technology native are wanting to use it for. And I would say that is actually the biggest barrier that needs to be overcome for broad adoption is just, can anyone use it to do anything that they need to do? And the answer to that right now is pretty much no in almost all cases. Unless you're like a student who wants to write a paper really quickly and just use ChatGPT to write it for you. Outside of that, it's not incredibly intuitive for most users.
So I want to go back to something that you said earlier. You said it's not driving a lot of revenue for vendors yet, and it's not particularly useful within organizations. This is something that's come up in a couple of discussions that I've had recently. One of our members in our platform posted an article that Canva is going to raise their rates for their team memberships by 4 times. So it's not just like a little bump, it's a huge bump. And that's because of the costs associated with the AI tools that they're implementing in. So I see this sort of coming down the path, but what we're seeing from vendors is they're not adding a whole bunch of value with their AI yet. They're doing the stupid things, right? The things that are safe and the things that can maybe make us more efficient, but I focus pretty heavily on the learning space. And what we don't need is more content. You know what I mean? And so they're focusing on the stupid things in your mind. How is this all going to play out? They're not providing things that are particularly interesting or useful. At the same time, somebody's got to pay for it. What's going to happen?
I think the last thing you said is the most critical thing, which is AI is very, very expensive. And right now, most of the costs are hidden because either investors are paying for it or Microsoft has paid for it in terms of, or the companies that host data centers or the companies that are paying NVIDIA, and giving it its crazy multiples right now. A lot of the costs of AI are hidden and eventually will be borne by the customer. They are not really borne by the customer yet. And when that happens, it's really going to push the issue of the value that is created by AI. Because we're talking about people analytics and people analytics generally resides in HR, I want to actually give kind of the other side of the equation too, which is, and we covered this on our podcast maybe a few weeks ago, but there was a ZipRecruiter study that showed on kind of hot topic issues in the workplace. How do employees and job applicants feel about those hot topic issues? And I think at the top of the list were things like working from home and 4-day work weeks and things like that. You know what was at the very bottom of the list? Adopting AI. And so what that tells you is, I think it was something like 20 or 21% of people were favorable for adopting AI. That means 80% of people don't want it.
Is it actually that they don't want it or they just don't care about it?
I can't remember the exact framing of the question, but there was a positive framing and a negative framing, and only 20% of people had chosen the positive framing. You could say, I think more generally speaking, that the sentiment is slightly negative in that space.
Interesting.
The other part of this that we saw in the People Analytics Tech study that's related is we found that 90% of the vendors in the study said that they have generative AI or also machine learning. We asked those same vendors' customers, does your vendor have AI? And only 40% of them said that they did. And then when we pulled back the cover and asked them about the time since deployment of their solution, those who were either pre-deployment or in the first 6 months were higher. They were actually up at about 60%. And then after that first 6 months, it dropped down below into the low 30s and kind of maintained there for the rest of the contract. It slowly went up, but very slowly. When we were interviewing folks and asked them, why is this the case? Because I was like, maybe it's just during the sales process, people are talking about AI, trying to get them excited about it, whatever. And our members said like something to the effect of, Stacia, you're really cute, but no, it just doesn't work. Like once we get in there, it's just not working how we're being told it will work. And thus it doesn't kind of exist. But tying back into what you were just saying though, Cole, is the other thing that we found was that by and large, there's real skepticism about whether people are getting the return on investment from their people analytics technologies. And so if these technologies then start to increase their pricing to pay for generative AI, and they already don't think that it really works, it seems like not a great situation for either customers or for the vendors themselves.
I couldn't agree more. Do you mind if I kind of nerd out on this for a second as to why perhaps it doesn't work? Because I think this is a really important point, and it's actually not a new point. It's an old point, which is these data to work effectively is completely and utterly dependent on the data quality and infrastructure you already have in place at your organization. And people analytics has struggled with this since day one. The thing I would say that I actually learned on the vendor side of the house, and I think you guys will find this funny, is people always think when you bring in a vendor and you turn it on, you're going to see all these magical results. The thing that always happens, and I mean always, is you turn it on and you figure out everything that's wrong with your data. And now you have the opportunity to fix the data, and then you might have a chance to get value out of it. But the one thing that AI added that was new beyond just that if your data sucks, you're not going to be able to use it, is you also need to have an additional layer of what I'll call a context layer on top of your data, which means you have to have really great descriptions of what your data is. It needs to be codified. You need to have dictionaries. And the reason why is because these LLMs have to query that context. So I think that the example I try to use is imagine you were a prosecutor in a courtroom. You as the user have to be able to ask questions of the data as if it were on the stand, the metaphorical stand, and it has to be able to answer those. But if the only thing it has to use to answer those questions is ones and zeros, it can't have the context to be able to answer your question effectively. And so you have to be able to equip the data on top of it with as much context as humanly possible to then be able to ask questions that are better. Otherwise, you run into this situation. I think this gets to the point you're making from your study, Stacia, is the vendors, what they try to do is to create a bunch of canned answers, right? And so they try to tie the type of request to a canned answer that they know that they can answer. If you ask anything that's not related to that canned answer, their tool can't help you. And to me, for most people, they really want to ask and be able to serve that kind of prosecutor type role. It's like the answer to the first question is never the answer. It's only about 7 or 8 questions in that you really get to some really good gold mining of what's going on. And you just can't do that today using any of these tools.
So let's make it maybe a little bit more practical. How are you experimenting with AI right now?
Sure. And I have to be somewhat vague about this so I keep my job. But I'll give you guys somewhat of the guardrails of how, when I guide my team, of how I think about AI. And I tell them, first of all, we are not experimenting. It has to work. Okay. Right? That's a huge hurdle. That eliminates 90% of the use cases right there. Second of all, what we produce has to be reliable and valid. Meaning, if we ask the same question twice, we get the same answer. I'll tell you one thing where I actually have a few less concerns than most people is the black box capacity of AI. And I'll tell you why. Is because I also guide my teams. We're going to do mathematical things and productivity saving things with AI. We're not going to make value judgments with AI. And where you really go awry is in the value judgment or the morality or the ethics area of using these AIs practically in the workplace. And so people always say they're concerned about, well, AI is a black box. We can't understand why it came to that conclusion. And the thing I tell people is, you know what else is a black box to almost everyone on earth? A calculator. But a calculator comes to the same conclusion every time when you ask it a question. And so if we can get reliable and valid responses from AI in the mathematical realm, I actually don't care how it came to that conclusion as long as it's correct. The other thing that it has to be is it can't be anti-productive. And so one of the things that you've seen in some of these recent releases is the ability, whether you're using Claude or some of the GPTs, what have you, is to load in a data set and do things like exploratory data analysis on the fly. But I actually consider those things to be anti-productive right now. And the reason why is because you actually have to do the analysis using the AI and then replicate the analysis yourself to make sure that the AI didn't have a hallucination. And so you have to do double the work, not half the work. I want to make sure that we are implementing this on use cases where AI is helping us actually save time and it's not just anti-productive.
So what kind of use cases are those?
I think it's around things, again, it's mostly productivity related. Again, use that prosecutor analogy. I want to be able to understand our data more effectively and get to solutions more effectively. And so I had this hypothesis I put forward probably almost 2 years ago now. I called the Inquisitor and the Change Agent. And essentially, what it means, if you boil down people analytics to its most simple form, it's really 3 steps. It is asking questions, it's using data to analyze those questions, and then it's taking action in the workplace, right? To make sure that whatever insights that you found, that you put them into action. And so I call it the Inquisitor is the one asking the questions, the change agent is the one taking action on the back end. The middle step in the equation of analysis, I think, is fully automatable. Maybe not today, but at least within the next 3 to 5 years. And so the use cases that we're focusing on is how can we use AI to automate the analysis step of that equation and make sure that, again, it's reliable and valid, it's not anti-productive, and all the things that I mentioned before. I think a lot of people use it for things like, can we write better job descriptions, or can we use it to analyze, to determine these different kind of judgments. But again, if we stay out of the value judgment space of like what is good, what is bad, and just producing what is, I think that is the most fruitful area. I will say one area that I'm thinking about, I'll be honest, we're not experimenting with right now, but I'm cautiously optimistic, is the AI agent space.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very curious as to if you can take, so one of the reasons why it can be difficult to automate something like analysis is because there's actually multiple steps and multiple roles that you play as an analyst if you're doing that data analysis yourself. Well, the AI agents, my understanding is, and again, this is an area where I'm wanting to dig in further, is that you can take different subsets or different verticals of that process and create an AI that is just superb at that one step, and then have those agents work collectively together to do that more effectively. That's an area that I'm wanting to look into over the next few months.
Yep. We are too. We're going to be doing our Q4 Tech Consortium webinar on AI agents.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. When you think about this, I mean, it sounds like you're, I'm going to put air quotes around it, excited about the potential for analytical capability of the AI. What else are you excited about?
I mean, the thing I used to say, I actually kind of got a little less excited because it was a little bit harder than I thought it would be, is I said, I never want to build another dashboard again. What if we never built another dashboard? What if we asked questions, we got answers to them, and it could create visualizations. It's not like I'm anti-visualization. I have kind of like a small critique and a large critique of dashboards. The small critique is I'm tired of building them. And frankly, most self-service dashboards aren't actually that. You end up having to consult on them to get any value because people don't intrinsically just go use them the way that you intend them to. There's a variety of reasons why, and I'm sure you could talk about that just as much as I could, Stacia. But the larger critique is I'm just not sure that this is the way that people analytics should be branding itself. And so in a lot of companies, dashboards and people analytics are considered synonyms, or reports and people analytics are considered synonyms. And I'm just from the school of thought, and maybe this comes from my workforce planning background, I don't know, but I'm from the school of thought that people analytics is so much more about driving value of the organization. And if the last thing that we do is create a dashboard, we are leaving so much potential value on the table that we've got to be better than that. I just feel like if AI hasn't been as helpful in automating that as I would like up until this point. That's not saying it won't be. And so my excitement level has gone down a little bit, but I'm also, again, holding out hope that the automation capabilities are really in front of us, not behind us. And so I think I saw a meme the other day where somebody was saying how I thought that AI was going to help me with my laundry and doing my dishes, and I would get to spend more time on creative work and writing and reading. And the reality is, it's doing all the writing and reading a creative task, and I get to spend time on doing laundry and dishes. I just am of the mind that I want it to be focused on doing the metaphorical dishes of people analytics and not on necessarily the creative tasks where I really think human beings can flourish.
So how do you think AI is going to help with that? How's it going to change people analytics moving forward? You've talked a little bit about it, but give us your vision.
I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. Like, I think people just assume that whatever OpenAI puts out there is what is going to be. And I think we have a chance, especially folks like you guys, because you're so embedded with on the research arm of our field, and we need folks like you, that you can drive the conversation to what we want it to be. If all people do is build chatbots, guess what AI will only be is chatbots. Mm-hmm. If we decide that we want it to do different things, it will do those things. We just have to put the effort and resources behind it. These things aren't magic. They don't just manifest. They're created. They take intention to get there. And so I've made my point of view very overt and very explicit that I want this to be focused on, again, the non-value judgment sides of things. I want it to be focused on the math. I want it to be focused on the parts of people analytics that are highly commoditizable. And then I want people analytics as a function to start moving up the stack of value in terms of moving not just from doing analytics, but moving into strategy, moving into operations, and moving into its ability to influence decision-making in the business. And fundamentally, I mean, I've even written in the past about how I think people analytics might be the future chief people officers of our function. If we don't focus in these areas, we won't be. It is not a foregone conclusion that people analytics will serve as a leadership role in HR unless we assume that leadership. That's what I'm personally driving towards and trying to bring the field along with me. I guess it's yet to be seen if that's going to happen or not.
Yeah, for sure. Let's step back a moment and talk about how you think the use of AI will change how you staff or how you think about the people within people analytics.
I think this is a longer running trend than just AI. I think AI accelerates this, but I have been of this belief for a while, which is folks who are in people analytics should be highly talented, highly capable individuals. If you're breaking into the field and you've just learned Microsoft Excel, there was a point in time where that was good enough. And I would like that point in time to be in the past. Now, that's not necessarily the case in all places. And I understand that. I mean, I did some research recently that showed that the average size of a people analytics team is only 2.75 people. Mm-hmm. That means that there's a lot of functions out there, a long tail of functions that have just one person or two people, right? And maybe three. And in those functions, a lot of times you'd be lucky to find someone who could write a SQL query. And that's okay. But once you start going up the curve of the more professionalized functions, let's call them, we need to be focusing on talent. We need to be focusing on truly talented people. And that doesn't just mean data scientists. I think data scientists are a part of the equation. I think folks like biopsychologists and labor economists are part of the equation. I think about things like the ability to truly lead and influence power in an organization is key. I see that things like the ability to stay on the cutting edge of what's not just what's going on in AI, but on data engineering as well, I think is a really key part of this, and having the talent in that space. And frankly, I think you'd be hard pressed to find any organization outside of perhaps 5 that isn't under-resourced in terms of data engineering. I think that there's a huge opportunity to invest in skills and resources in that space. I think it cuts across the entire spectrum. But if you get back to my hypothesis around the Inquisitor and the Change Agent, we need folks that understand the business who are going to be asking the right questions. And so that could be even people that come with backgrounds like HR business partners or MBAs or consultants, what have you, like the traditional consultants, not like a people analytics consultant. But also on the change agent side, these are folks that might have traditional backgrounds in change management, org development, and the like. And that's not necessarily the skill set that people analytics is over invested in. But I think that there's going to be a role for deep scientific expertise. I think there's always going to be a role for people who are able to influence authority. And I think there's going to be a role for making sure that teams make an impact on the business through and through. One of the things I've really struggled with lately, I published a recent series of articles on what's been going on in people analytics over the last 15 years. And it was almost a resounding positive reception to it. One of the pieces of pushback I got, though, that I thought was quite warranted is there's actually a huge body of people analytics that exist in the nonprofit sector and the governmental sector. And I'll be honest, almost everything I've set up until this point probably doesn't apply to those. I will say that that is one of the limitations of not only my knowledge, but the wisdom that I grant is that it's probably a different case altogether if you are residing in those sectors. And so I want to call that out as a small caveat.
I find it interesting, not interesting as in you're wrong, but just interesting that you said, hey, maybe the future of HR is that people analytics is at the helm. And then you introduced things that are often found in other parts of HR. I'm wondering if we all just get better at people analytics. Like maybe we actually, all of HR just becomes a data-driven juggernaut to make decisions that way. Do you see, because we are saying this in other places as well, some of the things are converging in on each other. And I wonder if one of the reasons that we'll be able to do that is solid people analytics.
That's a valid perspective. I think the question you have to ask yourself on an organization by organization basis is which one's easier and which one's harder. I think there's certain organizations that have heavily invested in the capability in analytics around their HR functions for the last 10 to 15 years. Those organizations are well positioned to do what you described. And I'll say they're probably a small minority. And on the other side of the equation, there's many organizations that if you do any type of research in the space or any kind of focus group and you talk to people analytics teams, what's the number one barrier that you're having? It's always upskilling the function in terms of data. If that's the case, someone has to lead. And I think people analytics folks are the most equipped. And there are kind of those sister functions out there, whether it be OD, whether it be change management, the ones I described earlier, that can come along for the ride with us. But who is ultimately the tip of the spear, the one that are really leading the change? And I think it is incumbent upon people analytics to be a part in driving the change of the narrative there.
I want to push back on that because I have been having a slightly different perspective on what I think
Let's do it.
Could happen. So we have been saying that HR needs to be data literate, and particularly HR business partners for like as long as I've been in this space, forever. And I don't think we're any farther along that journey than we were when I started.
No argument here.
And so I believe that potentially one of the benefits of generative AI could be that they don't have to be. Meaning that, to your point about the analytical capability and all the rest of that, the technology will be able to do it, whether it can do it well now or whatever in the future. I'm confident it will. If we're able to build systems where the right data are highlighted at the right time in the right place, maybe we don't all have to be people analytics people, as much as I would love them to be people analytics people. I just don't see it happening. Like I see people saying, oh, well, the tech can tell me what the attrition rate is in this geography, and that's enough. And now I'm going to go do my consulting work around it.
I'm sitting in the middle of both of you because that first one is key, right? Asking the right questions, that's where you get the right answers. And so if we don't have people that can ask the right questions and understand data enough to get the right answers, I don't know how we get to your dream, Stacia.
I mean, a lot of HR consultants are very good at asking good questions. They're just not very good at translating those into good analysis or questions and way to structure the data, et cetera. And I feel like there is a potential here for the AI to be able to translate from the intent to the analysis that needs to get done and to feed that back. Not today, guys. I'm not pretending it's today.
No, I think that's actually one of my own criticisms for my own personal uses of AI is like, why didn't you read my mind and know what I wanted you to do? And kind of the inference capabilities of the AIs to not just answer the question you asked explicitly, but the question behind the question. But I think I'm in Danny's camp here to a certain extent. When I talked about the Inquisitor and the Change Agent, I said, on the Inquisitor side of the equation, the number one capability that needs to exist. And it is also a skill gap in addition to analytics and just understanding of data is critical thinking.
Mhm.
Critical thinking skills are what is going to be required to effectively use AI, at least for the next few years. It may get superhuman in its abilities to help us out, but until that point, critical thinking skills are of a premium. And I also think there's a shortage of that, not just in HR, but in society. And I think if you looked up any of the education research about the state of affairs in United States education, they're trying to teach critical thinking skills and they're struggling. And this is a very wide problem that exists.
Yeah, well, now you're in my camp. And yes, absolutely, there's a problem. But part of the problem is the system that we're using. Yeah, just introduce a class on critical thinking, right? If none of the rest of the system requires you to think critically.
Yes. Danny and I, just as a side note, this is our big struggle with finding researchers. It's critical thinking. Yeah, I did a webinar yesterday where we were talking about leadership changes, behaviors that need to change. And critical thinking was one of mine.
Yeah.
I'm 100% with you on that.
Do you want my riff on this? Because I think it actually answers your question from earlier too about what am I hiring for in terms of the skills. And it looks like you're struggling with the same thing. Is the literally almost the only thing I hire for is critical thinking skills. And it's because it's always in a shortage. And I'll tell you, I don't think this is necessarily I'm giving anything away because I don't frame it this way in the job description. But one simple test I have for understanding if someone has critical thinking skills is, can you make an argument? And then can you make the other side of the argument? And if you can do that effectively, generally speaking, you probably have the ability for critical thinking. And if you can't, that means, because what I see education really preferencing nowadays, which makes no sense in the age of AI, but it made no sense before AI, but it makes it especially worse, is they preference recall. Can you memorize something? And memorization is the antithesis of critical thinking because it says, if A, then B. And what critical thinking states is, if A, let's consider the decision tree of alternatives for how we should go about approaching this and weigh the trade-offs.
Yeah, you just explained my undergrad and graduate degrees and why I'm in this field in a way that I hadn't really thought about before, because I am an engineer and that's all it is, right? They don't care if you memorize anything as long as you can get to the answer or an answer associated with the thing. We have to move on to our...
We don't have to. We can talk about whatever you want to.
We're going to take a break because it's getting deep here and just want to lighten it up a little. So maybe a question for you, Cole. Tell us a weird fact you happen to know for no reason.
Oh, goodness. Probably what I was just talking about. So one of the things when I bring somebody on our podcast and we always ask them, is there anything weird or idiosyncratic about you? And they are like, I don't know. And I give them 3 examples. I say, do you have 11 toes? Are you a twin? Or have you been abducted by aliens? Because if so, we want to hear about it. I know a very weird amount about things like aliens.
That does not surprise me.
Yeah. And the reason why is I actually try to look at it through a scientific lens, not through like a woo-woo or like whatever aliens are doing is like, how would you test from a scientific standpoint if an advanced species was coming and visiting you? How would you scientifically be able to know if it's happening if all of their technology is beyond you? And so I think about these type of things a lot. Again, inside of Cole's brain isn't necessarily a nice place. These are the types of kind of like fun facts or things that I'm always thinking about.
What did you say after that? All right. So speaking of nice places, what 3 items would you bring with you on a deserted island?
Well, probably a GPS phone, first of all, so I can get out of there. But I'm assuming this is if I plan to stay there for a while.
Yeah.
I'd probably need one of those flint things that can start a fire. That would help. Some kind of receptacle. I know if you like watch a movie like Castaway, which by the way, great FedEx shout out in Castaway. You find the jar that washes up to shore so you can keep water in it. But if I didn't know that was going to happen, I'd probably bring some kind of jar that I could keep water in. And then if it's a big enough island and I feel like there's wildlife, maybe like a bow and arrow or something that could help me acquire protein.
It's all very practical. I like it.
I'm a very practical person. I was like the kind of person that was investing in their 401k when I was like 19 years old. Like no one's doing this.
Okay, let's wrap it up with, give us the best piece of feedback you ever received.
Oh, I actually put this on my resume. This is not a common practice apparently, but I have a quote at the top of my resume, and it came from 360-degree feedback I got earlier in my career. And it said, it was actually not a compliment, but I took it as a compliment. It says, Cole has a maniacal focus on adding value to the business. And I put that as a quote at the top of my resume. So I feel like that was some of the best feedback I ever got.
Very good. Very good. It's funny where those quotes will end up. I have a quote on my LinkedIn from The Alchemist, which is a book by Paulo Coelho.
Mhm.
And randomly, somebody sent me an email asking me to attend a conference, and he is her uncle.
Wow.
And she was like, "Oh, I saw your quote. Like, I was so excited." I was that's fascinating. Anyway, moving on. Tech. Dun
Tech.
dun dun.
Tech.
So if we are thinking about tech and AI and people analytics, what do you think are the implications? What's going to happen?
There's a huge market opportunity for some aspiring individuals out there to go into this space and to go after some of those use cases and niches that I mentioned, because they are not being filled right now. And I think this goes back to the study that you mentioned earlier, Stacia, about people are saying that this wasn't what you said, but I'll use my own words, is that a lot of what teams are doing is they either have a co-pilot or they have a chat bot, and neither of those things are working particularly well. And so if I were an aspiring individual, I would be going out there and creating a people analytics company to sell as a service some kind of very narrow use case that could commoditize a step in the process that I mentioned earlier about maybe it's creating a dashboard, maybe it's just one step in the process, maybe it's cleansing data, doesn't matter, and really, really, really get good at it. Make sure that it works from end to end. And I think that's a huge opportunity in this space. And what's going to happen is essentially those companies are going to be the AI agents of the future, where you're going to have multiple combinations of these as like a suite of tools. And I think there's a huge opportunity in that space of having software. And I think that may like the traditional use of like SaaS, so software as a service, to have these multiple tools that work together effectively to create a whole solution, rather than the historical notion of you just buy, I'm not going to use anybody's name, but you buy one of these overarching platforms that does everything, your everything service. I think there's going to be a much more narrow, kind of decompartmentalized version of software in the future, where these AIs are going to be very, very good, probably superhuman at certain tasks. And I think there's a huge opportunity in that space. And frankly, as a potential customer of those firms, if you can do that, come find me, because I want to be an early adopter. I want to be encouraging of that. Because again, I think this goes back to the question you had earlier about what is the future of AI. I want to be driving the future of AI. And if we can make the right investments and the right type of tools, we can assure that it does the right type of things in the future.
You know what? It's so funny that you mentioned that, because I've been thinking the exact same thing. Like maybe the idea of a gigantic platform is going the way of the world now, and we're all going to buy features that we need and be able to link them together through agents and other things. The two things that I keep on running into is a UI and the data. How do we fix the data problem? But maybe there will be agents who will be able to do that as well.
Well, I mean, do you really want the real answer to how you fix the data problem? Is you have to get better tools and better users of those tools on the front end. Most of the data that exists, there's been a lot of talk in the last few years of what's called like digital exhaust. So like data just out in the ether. I'm not speaking about that data. I'm talking about the highly curated data that maybe is collected by your HCM, your applicant tracking system, your LMS. All of those are implemented poorly, generally speaking. They're not implemented with AI or analytics or data in mind in the first place. Though that generation of software gets disrupted by this new generation that is AI native. AI, for those to function effectively, are going to have to collect that highly curated data the right way the first time. It's not going to be one of these things where you turn it on and then 6 months later, 18 months later, you go in and you do this big audit of your data to make sure it's right and you get your data definitions in order. That's going to be incumbent upon that happening out of the gate with this next generation of software. And so I think largely, and that's going to be a huge shift. I mean, that's a 10-year shift in terms of, I mean, you guys know how long these contracts last.
Right.
It's going to take 10 years for the old ones to be replaced with new ones who can do this more effectively. But when that happens, I actually believe that the data problem will be fixed.
Do you know what's interesting, though, is I got off the phone with somebody who just implemented an LMS, which is pretty big. That's a pretty big implementation. She insisted on a year-long contract. She's like, we will probably renew every year, but we want to be able to get out of that at any time. I think that's really telling on like the trust that people have in these larger platforms, but also the future. I don't know what's going to happen to these larger platforms. We might be done with them, which is really interesting because we just got done consolidating. In fact, we're not even done consolidating yet.
I think that's a very wise actor. So well done on negotiating that contract.
I want to talk real quick about the UI UX thing, because this is something else we talked about in the People Analytics Tech Study. So if you were to assume that folks will access many of these tools via some sort of enterprise AI, maybe Copilot, not necessarily referring to the Microsoft branded one, but some sort of centralized single pane of glass.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make the UI UX investments that many of these vendors have put into place not necessary, or at least reduce the importance of UI UX? I mean, I think it does. And I think that many of these vendors should probably be quite concerned about that if they're willing to agree with that. But what do you think, Cole?
I think this is not a People Analytics comment. I'm probably wrong on this, but because anytime you get too far out of the future, you're likely wrong. I just don't even believe software will necessarily exist in 10 years. I think that any kind of application is going to be AI driven if AI can achieve the things that it intends to achieve. So what that means, just by deduction, is a lot of these UI UX things don't even really matter. Like imagine a self-assembling UI UX, right? So it's completely personalized to you and it gets better every time you use it. Traditional software can't do that. Like it just can't. And I see that as actually the future of how you're going to interface with some of these AI applications. And so maybe it's 15 years, maybe it's 20 years from now, maybe I'm completely wrong altogether, and that's fine. But that's the direction I see us going.
I wish we could keep on talking about this because I have questions about context with respect to that and silos. If you're only looking at your own thing and you never have to look at anyone else's, how useful is that information? You know what I mean? We can't talk about that, unfortunately. So think about it, Cole, and I'll call you this evening. We'll chat about it. We actually have to wrap up. So we're going to wrap up with our two final questions. Stisha, why don't you take the first one?
Yeah. As you've been reflecting on, let's call it the last 18 months or so, this whole AI journey, what's the biggest thing you've learned?
I know this is not the happy take, but I think I've learned to be more skeptical. Mm-hmm. When AI first came out, I was going in starry-eyed. Like I was so much, I wanted to be an early adopter. I wanted this to be the transformative thing. And I think I've gotten a lot more, not jaded, but just, I would say scrupulous in terms of understanding what's real, what's not. And also, I would say more realistically hopeful. I think I was more naively hopeful before, and now I am more realistically hopeful over the last 18 months.
I think that's good advice. Danny?
Final question for you is the one that we ask everybody on this podcast. Why do you do what you do?
And this is a huge identity thing for me. I've thought a lot about this lately. I'm probably going through like some kind of like midlife crisis or something at the moment. So you're catching me at a really great time. I've been thinking a lot about like, why do I do this? And I've had the opportunity countless times to become an HR business partner or go take the off ramp from People Analytics and go do something else. And I always come back and I'm like, why do I do this? And I think the reality is I don't care about data or analytics per se, just out of pure curiosity. I care about what they can do. And I care about what they can do for businesses, and I care about what they can do for employees. And that's what motivates me. I would even include that to go kind of in the workforce planning, talent intelligence realm, as I care about the entire labor market. I find that stuff fascinating. Like it's just so interesting to me. And so what intrinsically motivates me to do this work is I just like being, if I ever lose the thrill of what goes on there, I'll probably will switch to something that pays more, because with this skill set, I could probably make a lot more money, but I don't. And I choose not to because I enjoy this space. I think that's why I do what I do.
Cole, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Cole.
Thank you.
Okay, that's a wrap for this episode of Workplace Stories. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to our podcast so that you can be the first to know about future episodes. For exclusive access to our research, insights, and a vibrant network of human capital leaders, consider joining the Red Thread Research community. Visit redthreadresearch.com to learn more and to take your workplace to the next level.